Hello, everyone. This is John Einreinhofer for thegruelingtruth.net with another edition of Inside Mountaineer Basketball Weekly. And joining me here tonight for this edition of Inside Mountaineer Basketball Weekly is going to be Mike Goodpaster. And our show tonight is going to be sponsored in part by my law offices, the law offices of John Einreinhofer. You can find us on the web at johneLaw.com. And we concentrate in personal injury, wrongful death, employment law, and insurance matters. Mike Goodpaster with me tonight, who does all things sports for thegruelingtruth.net, including a lot of extensive stuff with college basketball. And, of course, this Saturday evening is going to be West Virginia taking on Kentucky in a sold-out game at the Mountaineer Coliseum. Game's been sold out for a while. Reports as of tonight are that tickets are going on StubHub for $300 to $3,000. And Mike, while this is a game that I'm certainly looking forward to, it means a lot to West Virginia fans, and of course, Kentucky is one of the most historic basketball programs in the country. Maybe just a touch of the lusters off this matchup that you would have expected a couple of weeks ago, or maybe at the start of the season, as Kentucky has actually fallen out of the top 25. West Virginia was as high as number 2, started to struggle a bit, and fell down to number 7, and then picked up a loss earlier in the week against TCU at TCU, and TCU had fallen out of the rankings. So the Mountaineers might very well be expected to drop when we get to Monday's polls, unless they have a very, very impressive performance against Kentucky. I know that Kentucky is unranked right now, but still they've got the name, John Calipari, all the NBA prospects. And even though the game is in Morgantown, an impressive performance by WVU maybe could stop the bleeding a little bit in the rankings. Mike, wanted to get you in here tonight to give a little bit of a outside the West Virginia perspective for this matchup of West Virginia and Kentucky Saturday night, and sort of where the Mountaineers and the Wildcats stand at this point in the season, and as opposed to the rest of the field in the NCAA right now.
Well, I think that West Virginia is a team that, as always, press Virginia, they're one of the best defensive teams in the country. But I still think the question comes down, as it does with all Huggins teams. And I lived close to Cincinnati. I'm a Xavier fan, so I remember Huggins at UC. And other than his 92 team, all of his teams were offensively challenged. And that's the question I have going into the rest of the season and into March with West Virginia, is defensively we know they're good enough to shut people down. But when you get a team that is scoring points, that may be hot from the three-point line, can West Virginia keep up with them?
Yeah, I agree, Mike, wholeheartedly. And it's, things could turn around, and we know the way college basketball is structured nowadays. Everything really is falling on the NCAAs. It's not even like the way it used to be when there were less teams that made the field and you had regular seasons determining automatic bids. There's just so much focus, and what we're going to remember is the NCAAs nowadays, the way things are structured. So I want to say that there's still, in that sense, a long way to go. But if you're a Mountaineer fan, you follow the Mountaineers regularly, and along the lines of the offensively challenged theme you talked about, Mountaineers are now 5-3 in the Big 12 after dropping 3 out of their last 4 games. They had a nice win against Texas at home, but 2 of those losses on the road to Texas Tech and TCU. Of course, Texas Tech has been a top 10 team during the course of the season, but still more of an upstart program in terms of the way they have surged in the Big 12 this year. And the Mountaineers dropped a close one to them, but then losing to Kansas at home, well, at first you would tend to say, well, that's Kansas. But the Mountaineers have beaten Kansas at home for years. Kansas hasn't beaten them in Morgantown. So that's a bit of a downward trend there. And TCU, which started the season on fire and in the non-conference being undefeated, then started to struggle with some close losses in the Big 12, falling all the way out of the rankings, but they beat the Mountaineers at TCU. And Of course, TCU's got Jamie Dixon at the helm now, but not a historically great basketball program. But Jamie Dixon had a lot of success at Pitt, and he certainly knows the Mountaineers well from his days in the Big East when the Mountaineers were also in the Big East, and as well as when Pitt was there, of course. So, but on the offensively challenged theme, one thing that I wanted to take a look at when looking to talk about the Mountaineers tonight is you look at they get a lot of points off turnovers, the Press Virginia style, and getting points off turnovers, but they are so reliant on points off turnovers that the offense can stall quickly in the half court. Bob Huggins even acknowledging that this week, that just the half court offensive troubles. But look at some of the 3-point field goal percentages for some of the Mountaineers. You got Daxter Miles, who can be hot and cold offensively, plays bigger than his size, at a shooting guard spot, but he's shooting .258, so 26% from three. Lamont West, a good-sized forward, a lot of potential there, can do some other things out there, but despite his size, he's a guy that shoots the three. He's at .323, so he's at 32%. And you don't have to be a great mathematician, Mike, to figure out when you use the logic of numbers, which does work in basketball at any level. If you're not shooting 33% or more from three and you're taking threes, you're not helping the team. So you look there with guys like Miles and West, the way they're shooting from three, that's not helping. Javon Carter's at 387, so he's at about 39%. He's obviously helping, and he's argued. Well, you got Trae Young now, so you can't say he's the best guard in the Big 12, but he's certainly the best defensive guard in the Big 12, and he's right there as one of the top guards in the Big 12. James Beetle Bolden, a Kentucky native, has helped the Mountaineers off the bench from three line this year. He's at 42%, but sometimes it seems that Coach Huggins is worried about what else he can do on the floor and that his minutes get shaved. And Issa Ahmad just coming back, you're not looking at him as a guy you're relying for three game, but he's shooting a respectable .375, so he's at 38% from three. But why I want to touch on all those three numbers is because Mountaineers get challenged. They have trouble in the half court. And, when you got guys that can't shoot threes and you're taking threes, you've got problems. Now, the bright spot has been Sagabak Kanate, who is really coming into his own. Mike didn't play a lot of basketball even before he got to high school and started playing late in high school. And he's one of those guys that you're not. It's not to your advantage to when you didn't start something when you're a little kid, like people who did. But when you're as good as he is and you started that late, the upside is there. And now the letters NBA are just starting to come out. He has surged so much forward. And Coach Huggins has talked about they want to get him the ball more, wanted to do that more at TCU, but weren't able to do it. We'll have to see if they do that tomorrow night with Kentucky. And Mike, have you gotten to see much of Kanate and how you feel about how he has surged lately?
He's a good player, but like I said, offensively challenged. And I think what this comes back to is this, John. I don't remember too many teams in history that were a full-court press team that shot the ball well. And I think a lot of that is this. You exert so much energy on the defensive side that if you don't get a layup, I mean, it's just human nature. No matter how good a shape you are, you play for 40 minutes at that pace, it's going to be hard to shoot the ball. And I think that's why a lot of teams don't play the way West Virginia does. Because, yeah, it would be effective for most any team that's 9 or 10 deep. But even at 9 or 10 deep, a minute in, even in good shape, at the frantic pace they play, it's hard to be able to calm down and run a half-court set on offense.
Well, Mike, I think you make an excellent point. I think that is where you get into some of the problems with the Mountaineers, whatever may be causing it. You're right. It could be the style with how much energy exerts, but not a lot of great three-point percentages. Then you look, they do play 11 guys regularly. Now, I think what could turn it around for the Mountaineers as we get down the stretch of the season, if this all can come together, is Issa Ahmad was out for basically the first half of the season because of an academic suspension. Now, they're only 1-3 with him back, and Bob Huggins is not blaming him, and I'm not either. I mean, when you've seen him enough and you know what he was coming out of high school in Ohio, he's too good of a player to think that it's him. Now, it may be just that integrating him into things, but he should. You're 1-3 with him, but he should be an offensive boost. Now, you have Ahmad, and he's been coming off the bench. Huggins has still elected to start Wesley Harris, who is not the offensive player, doesn't have near the experience of Ahmad, and he still kept Wesley Harris as the starter, got Ahmad coming off the bench. Whatever his reasons are for that, I'm sure he's got some. And I think it's pretty clear he likes Harris's defense. But, again, the offensively challenged thing is definitely coming up with the Huggins Mountaineers, and that becomes their problem. And you've also got another X factor in Teddy Allen, nicknamed Teddy Buckets, who had a couple of Big 12 games where he came off the bench and got 20. And then it's come out, and I was able to also get a little bit of inside information where Teddy Allen had been disrespectful to assistant coach Larry Harrison, who helps to run the practices with the Mountaineers. And apparently Coach Huggins felt he had to sit him down there, and I don't have any problem with that. Turned out that has been coming out, and that's apparently what that discipline was for. He went back into the rotation last game, was able to contribute a little bit, but not play on the level he was when he had gotten hot before he was sat down. So why I mention Ahmad and Allen is those are two good offensive players who have an inside type of game, even though Ahmad can also shoot from outside. If they can get their kind of scoring integrated with the rest of the team, and if Coach Huggins can find a way to get everybody enough minutes, still play his style, and then get these guys providing that offense, that could help solve some of the problems. Some of the other guys that the Mountaineers have coming off the bench, Magic Bender, Logan Rout, Chase Harler. That's where he goes 11 because you've got the full court style and guys get tired, but they have had trouble making any kind of offensive contribution whatsoever. And when you've got guys coming in that just can't contribute offensively, that's a problem when they're getting minutes. Some of those guys' minutes have gone down, and he's got to rest others, but that can be a problem. I think it comes down to, if Allen and Ahmad can really get integrated into things and provide the offense that they're capable of, that might solve some of that problem. Then Kentucky, Mike, they've got their usual freshman contingent. I guess officially they are the youngest team in the country, but we're used to that from Kentucky with all these one-and-done type of guys that Calipari brings in. So I don't see, for the way Kentucky has operated their program, that's really an excuse for them to be a team that's 4-3 in the SEC and out of the rankings. What are some of your thoughts on Kentucky this year?
Well, I just think this was bound to happen when you get guys like this. And the thing is this, he's only won one national championship with what it seems like 5 draftable NBA players every year, and he invariably loses to a team like, hell, you had West Virginia to 1 year, a veteran team that comes out and beats them in 2010. You had the Wisconsin team that upsets them when they were undefeated. They had 4 guys that were senior starters. And I think it's really hard to build a program like this. And it's like, I do an Indiana Basketball Weekly show with Steve Risley, who played on the 81 National Championship team. And Indiana's first-year coach, Archie Miller, and there's a guy by the name of Romeo Langford that every team in the country wants. And Langford's going to be a one-and-done guy. And me and Steve always discuss, well, is it good to have this guy or not? Because once you get him, other guys may not want to come because they know, well, for the next year, he's going to take all the shots. And you never get any continuity. And I think that's why teams like Butler, Butler's been the best program in the state of Indiana for the last decade because they've got seniors that are playing on their team. And you get a team like Kentucky, it's hard. If you don't get your cohesion before midseason, it's going to be hard. And the SEC, I don't think it's necessarily Kentucky's worse than they were than last year. I think they are a little bit. But the SEC, just like the Big 12, are 2 stacked conferences where you don't really get a breather. I mean, I think the SEC, the Big 12, and the Big East, from top to bottom, are the three best conferences in basketball because you got 9 or 10 solid teams in every one of those conferences now, and it's hard to show up every night and win on the road at a Florida. And then you come back, you host Mississippi State. Now you're going to West Virginia. And I think the thing that really hurt this team was the fact that their early season schedule with a young team was really soft. I mean, they played Kansas, who beat them. They played UCLA and lost to them, and UCLA's not that good. Kentucky usually plays a tougher non-conference schedule. Louisville was down this year, which hurt them. So I think the problem is this. Until they got to the SEC, they weren't playing big-time competition, and I just don't think these kids are ready to play at that yet. I think by the time you get tournament time, SEC tournament, I think they're going to be one of the 2 or 3 best teams in the SEC. But I think right now these guys are still trying to get their feet wet against good competition.
Yeah, they start 5 freshmen. They've got Knox, who is apparently projected to be an NBA at least mid-lottery pick. And Diallo is also looked at as an NBA prospect, but they may not actually have the guys that ended up being quite as talented to be one and done this year, as many as them as they normally have, which then, like you said, Mike, some college basketball experts, pundits are speculating maybe next year could be Kentucky's year because they're going to have more guys hanging around to go to next year than they normally do, but that this year may not be their year. But again, with the talent that Calipari normally has, you can't count them out. Of course, there is some good history with West Virginia and Kentucky, as you alluded to, Mike, the 2010 Classic win for the Mountaineers when they had a barrage of threes, when Bob Huggins did a great job adjusting to the guys he got from John Beilein and using some of his style and still keeping some of Beilein's style. And they knocked off a Kentucky team that year, had DeMarcus Cousins, John Wall, and I know Mountaineer fans don't mind reminiscing about that. I certainly don't. Took the Mountaineers into the Final Four, where it didn't work out for them against Duke, but that was a great Final Four run and a Big East tournament championship team, a great Mountaineer team, and beat a Kentucky team with that kind of talent. Certainly one of the best wins in the history of the West Virginia program. And I hate to mention it, but in fairness, have to mention it.
No, don't mention it. Don't talk about it.
Rematch.
Don't talk about it.
The rematch, so to speak, in 2015. And Mike, you and I are both, of course, big boxing fans, and we report and follow the sport. And as I watched that game in 2015 as a boxing fan, I very early on was saying, my God, if this was a fight, please, referee, stop it, because it was that bad, a 78-39 loss. So the Mountaineers do have a couple guys left, including Daxter Miles, who played in that game and made an ill-fated prediction, let's say, that the Mountaineers would give Kentucky their first loss that year when Kentucky.
Yeah, but let's go back to 2010 for West Virginia fans. Nobody wants to hear about this on a day or the night before they play Kentucky. The thing that stood out to me about the 2010 game, correct me if I'm wrong, I'm not real sure, but if I remember right, that was one of Huggins' greatest jobs coaching, because everybody thinks they're going to come out pressed, they're going to play man-to-man defense. And if I remember right, they played at a 1-3-1 zone, and it took Kentucky like 36 minutes before they made a three-pointer after missing its first 20 attempts.
Yeah, and you're absolutely right, Mike. You've got a great memory on this stuff. I consider myself to have a good memory, but I think you got me on some of this stuff, because you're absolutely right. And of course, I remember that, but I watch every West Virginia game. What Coach Bob Huggins did, I think it was arguably his best coaching job, because as we know, when you get on in life, it's when you can put away the ego a little bit and make the adjustments that sometimes those are really the great performers in athletics and coaching. And what Bob Huggins did that year was John Beilein had run that 1-3-1 zone, and Coach Huggins does tell a great story about that. He says that, he had never run a 1-3-1, but he looked at the personnel he had, and he put his ego aside. He said he went to the players that were left over from Beilein and said, hey, I'd like to keep this in. It worked for you guys. Why don't you show me how you did it? Practiced it, kept it in his back pocket, and then started pulling it out when he needed it. And it did surprise some teams and force them to start doing some different things, and including that Kentucky team.
Well,
and
see,
it was
John,
very effective.
real quick, the other thing that I remember about that game, and it's kind of what we were talking about a minute ago with all the freshmen, the thing I remember about that game is how Kentucky lost their poise. I think DeAndre Liggins drew a technical foul in the first half. And, that team looked overwhelmed. They looked frustrated. And, it got to the point where West Virginia, I think, made them quit just because they didn't know what else to do against them.
Yeah, it was great. And again, Beeline, of course, had that system where he worked it in the half court for open threes. A lot of three-point shooters were still left on the roster for Bob Huggins. And then he had, to his credit, he brought in Kevin Jones. He brought in Kevin Jones, Devin Ebanks, two guys that had a cup of coffee in the NBA. So he integrated them to it. But they were still shooting those threes, and they hit Kentucky with that three barrage. And it was a great win, a 73-66 Mountaineer win. Again, one of their greatest wins in program history. And there are a lot of fun facts about this semi-rivalry because they don't play all the time, but with the states being contiguous, it is a good matchup for the fans and a fun and important matchup. And, of course, we even had the Hatfields and the McCoys. The Hatfields, of course, were based in West Virginia, and the McCoys were based across the Tug River in Kentucky. So there's all kinds of historic West Virginia-Kentucky rivalry going
Hey,
into
I
this.
remember this, too. Didn't they play in the 1984 Hall of Fame Bowl, too, in football?
I believe that does ring a bell. I think that is correct. Your memory's coming in to play again there, Mike. And I think
anything before 1990, I'm golden on. After that, it's
right.
kind of shaky at times. The only reason I remember the Kentucky-West Virginia game in 2010 so well is, frankly, I live in Indiana, and I hate Kentucky.
Yeah, and a lot of people do, and they're easy to hate, especially with the Calipari one-and-done NBA thing. And, obviously, there's a lot of this feeling around for West Virginia and Kentucky in this matchup because ESPN's College Game Day is going to be there at the Coliseum tomorrow, and they're going to be setting up at 11. And, Mike, I think one thing that is just a fact, no matter where you live in the country, but, it's great for West Virginia fans and what's happened. Coach Huggins has commented on it this year. You've been hearing the national commentators comment on it in recent years. Morgantown has now developed with the success with John Beeline and Bob Huggins picking up that torch, carrying it forward. Morgantown's now become one of the toughest places to play in college basketball, and it's getting known for that. The crowds are up to really their highest level ever. Got another sellout here for Kentucky. Been selling out, of course, sold out for Kansas. And really, I think the WVU Coliseum now, you're getting people everywhere are starting to acknowledge that this is becoming one of the toughest home floors to play on in college basketball.
Yeah, and I think with Huggins, he did the same thing at UC. And what people don't realize, what Huggins did at UC was one of the best rebuild jobs ever. Because the Cincinnati Bearcats, 1976, I think they lose in overtime to Adrian Dantley in Notre Dame. They had Pat Cummings, who was a great player. 1977, they had Cummings again. They had a huge victory over Indiana in the Sugar Bowl Classic in New Orleans. And then you get to 1978, the Gail Catlett, which I know was a West Virginia coach at some point also.
Yep.
But that program got run into the ground, and it really went into the ground when Tony Yates got there in the early 80s. And, of course, Yates' probably crowning achievement was losing to Kentucky 24-11 in the stall game back in, I think it was November or December of 1983. And UC, it was a huge deal in 1985 when they made it to the NIT. There was no NCAA tournament from, I think, 76, 77, all the way up to when Huggins got there. And when Huggins got there, they had just built the Shoemaker Center, which was a new arena. And I remember the first game there. And I'm not a UC fan, but I watched it. They played Michigan State. I think Michigan State had Steve Smith. And UC hit a buzzer winner to win the game. And 90-91, they got a little bit better. Then in 1992, he got Nicky Van Exel in. And from there, I mean, he takes them to the Final Four. They blew out Penny Hardaway in Memphis in the Elite Eight, I believe it was, in '92. Then in '93, they lost a great game in overtime to North Carolina. From there on, it was rough sledding for him. In 2000, he had Kenyon Martin. He was the number 1 seed. Martin breaks his leg. They end up getting knocked out, I think, in the second round of that tournament. So Huggins has never had great success in the tournament, but I don't think you can doubt he's a great coach just from the way he turned around Cincinnati, and then he comes to West Virginia and continues on what John Beilein had done.
Yeah, and that has been impressive. One thing, Mike, what are your thoughts on, again, you have a good command of the history of college basketball over those decades you're talking about. Could Huggins have gone all the way if Kenyon Martin had not broken his leg that year? That is something that even Mountaineer fans now often discuss when looking back at Huggins' Cincinnati career.
That was in 2000, wasn't it?
I don't remember the exact year when that. I remember it and when it happened, and it was a very, very good Cincinnati team. But I couldn't tell you the exact year right off the top of my head.
Because I think the problem with that team in 2000 would have been when they'd run into Michigan State. Because I think Michigan State won it all that year because they had the best point guard in college basketball. If you look at UC, if I remember right, their guards were DeMar Johnson and Steve Logan, both very good players. I mean, they were a deep team. They brought Kenny Satterfield, Ryan Fletcher off the bench. I think this. I mean, the problem with Huggins has always been, even with great expectations, he had a tendency to come up short. I think it's really hard to say he would have won the national championship, but I think they had the best team. I'm just saying, when you look at Michigan State from 2000, I think the way Michigan State's team was built, I think they'd have been a really bad matchup for UC. It's kind of like, if you use a football analogy, Super Bowl 42. The Giants were not better than the Patriots, but the Giants' strength was up front with the defensive line. The Patriots had problems with guys that could get in Brady's face without having to blitz him. It's still the same to this day. I mean, it's going to do a lot towards what happens in the Super Bowl next weekend. And when you look at that, I mean, I think they were the best team, but I think if they would have had to play that Michigan State team with Tom Izzo, Mateen Cleaves, I think they would have had a lot of problems.
Yeah, and segueing off of that, Mike, let's look at the Mountaineers' chances at this point, handicapping it. Is this the year the Mountaineers could overtake Kansas for they've put themselves in a hole already, so I don't want to say the Big 12 regular season title at this point, but for the Big 12 tournament title. Could they get by Kansas this year and become Big 12 tournament champions?
I think there's no doubt they can. The problem with the Big 12 is you can't just look at Kansas now. I mean, you got Texas Tech, Trae Young, Oklahoma. I mean, you got teams like Baylor and LSU who could jump up and beat you at any time. And I know West Virginia blew Texas out, but Texas has shown they can play with people also. And when I look at this, I mean, the thing that worries me the most about West Virginia is their non-conference schedule, just like Kentucky. I mean, you're beating American, Long Beach State, Central Florida, Morgan State, New Jersey Institute of Technology, whatever the hell that is. And you look at them, Texas A&M blew them out the first game of the year. That's a throwaway game, but Texas A&M's a really good team. I think there's no doubt they could win the Big 12 tournament. But I also think this, and this may sound crazy, but they may be better off with a number 3 seed not winning the Big 12 tournament just because of the frenetic place they pay. And if you look at most of these teams that win their conference title on a Saturday or a Sunday, they're not as successful the next week.
But there's starting to be some debate about that. And if I recall, I think it was, of all people, I think Bill Self might have even hinted to that last year that, it's getting to a point, again, with not the meaning you would like in winning a regular season championship and the conference tournament that, as you alluded to, Mike, really starting to become a question in college basketball very recently, where people are being more upfront about it. Yeah, are you even better off getting a little rest by not going to the final of your conference tournament and getting some extra rest for the NCAAs if you know you're gonna be in? I guess then that's where it comes down to, well, how much does the seeding matter in the NCAAs? Of course, at some point it matters, because if you're a 1 seed and you're basically getting a first round bye when you're playing a 16 seed, because a 16's never beaten a 1. But if you're not a 1, then it gets maybe a little iffier. How much is it going to matter? And if you're not going to pick up a 1 seed by your performance in the conference tournament, or if it's not going to cost you a 1 seed, how much does it matter?
Yeah, and if you're looking at the conference tournament right now, if you set this up, just off the top of my head, look at the standings, you could end up playing TCU, Oklahoma, and then Kansas to win the Big 12 tournament.
Yeah, I think it's not, to me, hype as somebody who follows the Big 12 regularly this year. There's been many years since the Mountaineers have been in the Big 12, or when they were in other conferences. At the conferences week, I'll say it, this is not a weak Big 12 conference. This strength is for real, because what you said, Mike, it's top to bottom, all 10 of those teams. You've got a lot of conferences where you've got some patsies in there where, you're going to get an easy night. I mean, the worst team in the Big 12 right now is Iowa State. That's a program that's had a lot of success in recent years. And again, they're the worst team in the Big 12 just because the Big 12 is so tough this year. So, there's really, and then everybody else is like you said, Texas with the big men they got, Bamba and Ostenkowski, even though WVU hammered them on their home floor, in the Big 12 tournament, you don't get to play on your home floor. So you got to play at a neutral site, and that's different. That's the other thing that concerns me slightly about the Mountaineers is I want to be optimistic, but this troubles me just a bit, what we're seeing in the last couple of weeks, which is this. They lost to Kansas on their home floor. They've been beating Kansas in Morgantown in recent years. They've got a road loss to Texas Tech, road loss to TCU. And what I'm getting at is, if you're losing to Kansas at home, which Kansas is Kansas, but you've been beating them at home, and then you're losing to good Big 12 teams you're playing on the road, could that possibly be a bad omen for the Mountaineers going forward?
They've played decent on the road. Kansas is a good team, though. No matter when you play Kansas, that's a hard game. I wouldn't read too much into it. And the point is this. It only matters how you're playing at the end of February. And, I mean, right now, I think as a coach, you don't worry about wins and losses so much, especially if you got 15 of them and you're in the Big 12 or the Big East or the ACC, because you're probably going to make the tournament with a few more wins. I think the thing you worry about is just getting your team prepared for the tournament. And I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing to lose a close game against the number 5 team in the country. I think it's a bad thing when you are playing teams that aren't very good, because even if you're good, you're not battle-tested. So West Virginia may come out of this season 20-10, but it's a 20-10 that's battle-tested and ready to play in the tournament, if you know what I'm saying. Where you've had past years with the Big 12, you might run in there at 25-5, and all of a sudden you're getting dropped in the second round because you weren't playing good enough competition during the season.
Yeah, and you look at it, the Mountaineers are 16-4, ranked 7 in the country now. They've been as high as number 2. They've got a win over Virginia. They've got a win over Oklahoma. So there's still a lot of good stuff there, and it's the type of thing could get back rolling again with a big win against Kentucky, Saturday night. I think what I'm looking for following this team regularly is, and I actually get excited about it because I can see where they could be playing very, very well, and this team comes together. They could make a run for the whole thing. I thought that going into the year. They were ranked as high as number 2. I did think going into this year that this would be the year that they would overtake Kansas, win the Big 12 tournament. So I'm not going to change from that now because I don't think there's any reason to. Of course, the 1-3 stretch is troubling, but like you said, Mike, it's how you're playing at the end. And in February, you really want to make sure you got it going. And I think they can because they had Ahmad out for the first half of the season. They're getting him back integrated. They had the little disciplinary problem with Teddy Allen, but I liked what I saw for him. From him, he's got an inside game. He's not that big. He's about 6'5", but he's an inside player. That's his style. But he gives you quick offense there. So what I'm looking at that I'm excited about this team is you get Issa Ahmad back and integrated. You get Teddy Allen then coming off that sort of unofficial suspension. He's getting back integrated. He's only a true freshman. He starts scoring like he was early in the Big 12 schedule, which was impressive because it was Big 12 games where he scored 20 off the bench. So the potential's there. You get Ahmad and Allen providing that offense, filling in for that offensively challenged problem we've talked about, which I totally agree with. And then you've got Konate coming on like a house of fire, becoming a highlight reel really nationally with his block shots. Of course, that's on the defensive end. But all of a sudden, in the last few games, showing this flashes of a diverse offensive game where he's starting to hit 15-footers. His range is moving out. It's not that you want him doing that all the time, but he's doing it. His post-offensive game is looking good. It's just not all dunks now. So you've got Konate with that inside presence, and then you've already got the most veteran backcourt in the country in Javon Carter and Daxter Miles Jr. That's a big advantage to have two good veteran guards like that when you get to crunch time as we get to later in the season, Mike. And we know a lot of Power 5 teams that are tough, they just don't have that with these guys that go to the NBA and they aren't around for 4 years anymore. So that gives West Virginia potentially a big advantage there. So, again, the defense is there. The problems sporadically being offensive challenged have to be solved. They had a good run last year. That can be solved at times. And I think that this year, Ahmad's already been there, but he's been out. And then with Allen, the true freshman, if he can get back to being a factor, that might make up for those lost points, so to speak, that they haven't been getting in recent weeks. And then I wonder, how far can this team go, Mike, in the NCAA tournament?
Well, I think this, John. I think Kansas wins the Big 12 tournament, and West Virginia goes farther in the tournament. I think West Virginia is a better team. I think they're built better for a one-and-done thing. I'm not sold on Kansas from the times I've seen them. They're kind of hit and miss. The one thing about West Virginia, even if the offense isn't there, the defense usually is. So I think they're a possible Sweet 16 team again. I think when you match them up and you look at the other top 10 teams, I think they have a rough time matchup-wise with, Villanova. I think Villanova's a really bad matchup. I think a team like Xavier's a tough matchup just because they got senior. I mean, both of those teams have senior backcourts. And I think that's where you run into problems. But as we talked about in the tournament, it's not even so much where you're seated. It's who wins that you're going to play the next game. I mean, a perfect example is 1981. Said I do the show with Steve Risley, the Indiana show. 1981, Indiana got to play in the Sweet 16 against UAB because they'd pulled a huge upset the game before. And in the Elite Eight, they got to play St. Joseph's because St. Joseph won a game in a buzzer with John Smith hit the shot at UD Arena and beat the number one team in the country, DePaul. You look at Xavier last year. They came out of nowhere, and, they beat Arizona, but that win over Arizona made it so Gonzaga, the 2 seed, didn't have to play Arizona. So, I mean, a lot of this is not even where you're seated. It's just what happens around your seed, if you know what I'm saying. Because every year there's a few teams that get upset, and you have a team like a Xavier or a Dayton or a Butler that all of a sudden finds themselves in the Elite Eight. So a lot of this is luck. And winning a championship, no matter how good you are, is probably 90% luck. Not getting your players hurt, that's a huge one. And then where you draw in the tournament and the teams you have to play, because we've all seen it before. We talked about 1992 with Huggins. He takes UC to the Final Four out of nowhere. And the thing was, that was because of upsets. Kansas gets beat in the second round, so UC all of a sudden is playing Virginia. In the Elite Eight, they're playing Memphis because Memphis upsets somebody. Memphis was an 8 seed. So UC, as a I think it was a 3 seed, ended up playing Virginia, who was a 6 seed in the Sweet 16, and they played an 8 seed Memphis in the Final Four, or in the Final 8 to go to the Final Four. So a lot of this is luck. Because, I mean, you get stuck in a tough bracket, there's no upsets, you got to fight your way through that. But you get a little bit of luck, and all of a sudden things start to go your way, and just like in 2010, nobody thought West Virginia was a Final Four team, but that's where they ended up.
Yeah, and dare I say it, I agree. There's skill involved, talent, hard work, etc. We all know that. That's the truth. But there is luck involved. You cannot completely ignore the factor of luck, what breaks are going to happen, and like you said, being in the right spot in the right time in the brackets with what happens around you. And I think one thing that helps West Virginia in the NCAA tournament that doesn't help them in the Big 12 tournament or during the Big 12 regular season is with the Press Virginia style, the Big 12 in basketball and football has a true old-fashioned home-and-home schedule where everybody plays each other home and home. You play everybody. So these teams see the Press Virginia twice a year. Huggins has been running this, for a few years now. They're familiar with it. When you get into the NCAA tournament, if West Virginia's not playing another Big 12 team, these teams haven't seen this. And that gives them an advantage, especially when you get in a situation where you've got the one-day turnaround with who they're going to play next.
Yeah, so, and I think that one day, I mean, you play in the Big 12 conference tournament to win it. You got to play 3 straight days at that pace, and that's damn near impossible.
Yeah, and who you're playing seen it. They see it twice a year, every year now. So, in the NCAAs, these other teams haven't seen it. They just don't have time to prepare. And I think that I always then feel a little more comfortable about the Press Virginia when we get back into the NCAA tournament because of that factor. Because, even if you're playing another very good Power 5 team, if it's not a Big 12 team, they haven't seen it unless somebody WVU happened to play during the regular season, which the odds are against that with not that many non-conference games against tough teams. You're talking about Kentucky, Virginia. So, if you're not running into Kentucky or Virginia, they haven't seen it, and they still, even if it was those teams, they don't see it like the Big 12 teams do twice a year, year after year. So I think that gives West Virginia a lot more hope when you get to tournament time. Mike, any final thoughts about tomorrow's game or WVU and UK for the rest of the season?
Well, I think this game comes down to 2 things. I think number 1 is, can Kentucky contain Javon Carter, or however you say his first name. It's supposed to be an A in there, not an E. Somebody should have told his parents. But when you look at it, he's the only player in the nation averaging more than 16 points, 6 assists, 3 steals per game. He leads the nation, I think, with like 68 or 70 steals. The key for the Wildcats, to me, would seem to be able to grind on Carter, try to wear him out, so he can't take over a game on both sides the way he's capable of. On the other side, and I think this is the biggest key of all, is can Kentucky's freshman guards handle the press? And in the end, I don't think they can. And it would not surprise me if West Virginia wins this game by double digits. I'm going to pick Kentucky to lose this game by 9, so it's not double digits. But I got West Virginia 77. I got Kentucky 68, but it would not surprise me if it was worse than that.
Mike, I got to agree with you there. I think that score sounds about right for Morgantown and this matchup. West Virginia struggled a little bit as of late, but Kentucky's fallen out of the rankings. They did beat Mississippi State earlier in the week, a solid win. But Mississippi's 2-5 in the SEC right now, so we still don't know exactly where Kentucky's at. West Virginia's got to turn around that offense, but usually that happens in Morgantown. I mean, they just laid it on Texas, and as you said, and I agree with you. It's not like Texas is a bad team. I mean, Shaka Smart's a good coach. They've got Bamba, who's going to be going straight to the NBA.
Well, they beat Texas Tech, I think, right before you guys beat the crap out of them, didn't they?
Yeah, and they've got Austin Kowski, who's tough. Two big guys who can do a lot. And Mountaineers just just really annihilated Texas. So, they're despite losing to Kansas, the Mountaineers very, very tough at home, and this might not be good enough of a Kentucky team to be able to deal with that in Morgantown. The crowd's going to be totally amped, pumped up. You've got ESPN College Game Day there. Always adds to the atmosphere, gets people even more pumped up. That's just the way it is. You're national TV all day. It's great exposure for the town, the university, and Morgantown's a great town. So everybody's looking forward to that. As you also said, of course, nobody has any love for Kentucky, so that should take care of the motivation there. So you would not think there'd be any kind of letdown there. I would agree with your prediction, and I'm just looking kind of a little deeper into things, as I keep alluding to. I want to see, Issa Ahmad and Teddy Allen really get fully integrated into this offense. And even though it's on the home floor, I'd be content to see that West Virginia offense explode a little bit more with those guys involved. Beetle Bolden is the guy that shot the three well, and when he continues to do that and get minutes, that really helps the Mountaineers. So you want to see that more. He's got extra motivation. He's from Covington, Kentucky, so look also for him tomorrow night to potentially have a big game. He's got plenty of motivation there. So that'll do it for us tonight on Inside Mountaineer Basketball Weekly. I want to thank Mike Goodpaster for being with me tonight here on thegruelingtruth.net. And this has been sponsored in part by my law offices, the law offices of John Einreinhofer. You can find us on the web at johnelaw.com. Mike, thanks for being with me tonight, and look forward to tomorrow's action.
Most definitely, John. Thanks for having me on.